Well, good afternoon. I'm David Carrasco, the Neil Rudenstein Professor at Harvard University, and I'm very pleased to be part of the Mexicolore's educational project. And the question I want to discuss this afternoon is the fascinating question as to whether or not the Aztecs really thought of the Spaniards as gods when they first arrived on the edge of the Mesoamerican world in 1517. This is a very interesting question because it allows us to talk about two very different worldviews, the Spanish worldview and the Aztec worldview. The first way to answer this question is to identify what is the evidence that we have that indigenous people in Mesoamerica, when they first met the Spaniards, might have confused them with their own gods or thought of them as superhuman beings. In fact, there is some very fascinating evidence that the Spaniards did appear this way to the Aztec mind. For instance, in the 12th book of the Florentine Codex, which was collected by Bernardino de Sahagún in interviews with Aztec elders, we're told straight out that when the Spaniards, in fact, first appeared on the coast of Mesoamerica, that the word got up to the Aztec king Moctezuma, and that in fact he thought that perhaps it was, quote, Quetzalcoatl who had arrived. Now, Quetzalcoatl was an ancient Toltec king, and this was a king who had ruled a fabulous kingdom years, centuries before the Aztecs came into being. But the Aztecs were all taught in their schools that there had been this great hero, priest, king, ruler named the Feathered Serpent who had ruled in this wonderful kingdom, had eventually been defeated by rivals, and had sailed away, promising one day to return. And it appears from this text that I've just mentioned that Moctezuma himself was thinking about that story when he first heard about the Spaniards arriving. There's other evidence. For instance, in Bernal Diaz del Castillo's account of the conquest of Mexico, he reports that as the Spaniards were making their way up the coast, eventually to Veracruz, and then across the mountains into Mexico City, that he heard, as well as Cortés, that the indigenous people thought of the Spaniards as somehow divine beings. There's other evidence as well, and so I have no doubt in my mind as a scholar that in fact for a period of time the Spaniards were perceived as, well, what exactly? What exactly were they perceived at? And here, to finish that sentence, you have to shift now not to the reports of the Spaniards interviewing the natives, but how did the natives think? Native peoples in Mesoamerica didn't think about gods and humans as being as far apart as people in Europe did. Europeans tended to think of gods living in heaven, human beings on earth, and that there was this great distance that had been closed only once, really, by Jesus Christ. The indigenous people of Mexico didn't think that way. They thought that the gods and the humans were very close to one another. As a matter of fact, they thought that humans and deities shared the same essence. Gods were different, but human beings had some of that difference within themselves. And Mesoamerican people looked at extraordinary humans as having gods in them, or they thought of very powerful events in nature as being filled with God, filled with divinities. And so when the Spaniards came, they also learned about this, and they called these kinds of beings hombre dioses, that is, human gods, people who were part human and part gods. So the answer really is that at the Aztecs, when they saw these extraordinary people coming in with horses, with cannons, and Cortés himself being able to command not only Spaniards, but also indigenous people who became his allies, it looks to me like the Aztecs did think of them not as gods, but as extraordinary beings who shared a divine essence that allowed them to do superior things. Within the Aztec world, Moctezuma was a hombre dios. He was considered. Great warriors were considered hombre dioses, that is, divinities. Beautiful women were considered to have divine beings in them. So for the Aztec, divinities were all around them. And certainly when the Spaniards came, and they had extraordinariness in their weapons, in their language, in their size, and in their ability to fight, the Aztecs did view them as these powerful beings, which in fact they were. Soon, of course, the Aztecs realized that the Spaniards could be killed, they could be eaten, they could be defeated, and therefore their extraordinariness was diminished. But still, the Spanish leaders and the Spanish language was a carrier of a cultural meaning that the indigenous people eventually wanted to adopt, and they did, and they transformed it into the Mexico that we have today.